Welcome to Foresight, a podcast about HR, leadership, and the future of work. I'm one of your co-hosts, Naomi Titleman, and I'm pleased to welcome our next special guest to our show, Rebecca Hines. Rebecca is a leading expert on organizational behavior, and she works with companies navigating the challenges of modern work. She founded the Work Innovation Lab at Asana and the Work AI Institute at Glean. Her research has been featured in publications like Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many more. She's also an instructor for CNBC's Make It Masterclass called How to Use AI to Be More Productive and Successful at Work. And I'm very excited to chat about your new book, Rebecca, today, Your Best Meeting Ever. Welcome to Foresight, and how are you doing today, and where are you joining us from?
Thank you so much, Naomi, for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting. I'm joining from Mountain View area, which is south of San Francisco.
Great. And we love to talk about the weather because I'm here in Toronto. So how's the weather today?
Oh, funny. I'm originally from Toronto, so I'm very accustomed to the differences, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful day. It's funny because San Francisco and Mountain View, where I live, quite different. Easily can be 10 degrees different, and usually it's a lot warmer down here.
Nice. I didn't know that Toronto connection. That is very exciting. We're going to have to catch up on that as well. Here, in case you're wondering, it is gray, like it always is in Toronto. And it still feels like winter, which I'm not super thrilled about after having come back from Vegas, where it was 100 degrees, and coming back to this still seemingly winter. But Easter weekend this weekend as we're recording, and hopefully the weather will change soon.
Yes. Great city. It'd be nice if it were a little bit warmer year round.
Yes, agreed. Okay, well, before we get started, we like to check in. So my check-in question for you today is, what was your best meeting ever, if you remember it, and what made it so good?
So I've led research functions in organizations for a while now, innovation type functions. And I think my best meetings consistently are those early stage brainstorming meetings around a new piece of research. Because I think I've learned over time how to structure them in a way that I know is going to be most productive. In the book, I talk a lot about brainstorming and the myths we have around brainstorming. Overwhelmingly, the evidence points to the fact that we don't brainstorm most effectively collectively. It's far more effective to do what's sometimes called brain writing, brainstorm independently, and then come together as a group after, prevents groupthink and a whole bunch of different biases. So I love these, structured brainstorm sessions where everyone has had a chance to review the research and we're coming together to, spitball, play off of each other's ideas, get into the weeds in terms of, okay, why might we be seeing this in the data? What's most interesting? What's weird? And that type of early, brainstorm session, there's nothing better in my opinion.
That's great. And we're not going to go deep on this topic right now, but I hope we will a little bit later, because there was a big debate at Transform with a few people about AI or not to AI when it comes to brainstorming.
Yes.
So I'm going to plant that seed now, and let's talk about it a little bit later. I'd love to get through a few questions before we go into AI, if we can.
That sounds great. It's hard.
It's very hard. Let's start with you. If you can share with our listeners a bit about your career journey and what compelled you to write Your Best Meeting Ever.
Sure. So I'm originally from Toronto. I came to the States, California, to swim. In college, I was a competitive swimmer and always dreamt of swimming for the US and for Stanford in particular, and very quickly fell in love with entrepreneurship and organizational behavior. And why is it we can create a great sports team where the sum is greater than the individual parts? What if we were to create that type of environment for our workforce and for people in organizations? And from a very early stage in my undergrad degree, I became fascinated by the science of organizations, the science of leadership, the science of collaboration. After college, I went to Dropbox to lead a lot of their customer insights function and working with customers to help them understand how they were collaborating. I then spun up a similar type of muscle and function at Asana alongside the Work Innovation Lab, which was our internal think tank, where we partnered with great academic researchers, great industry experts to understand how the world of work is changing. And I've long been passionate about bridging this disconnect that we so often see between academic research and what actually happens in our organizations. And the lab was meant to bridge that gap. Last summer, I joined Lean to lead their Work AI Institute, which is aimed to deeply understand how the world of work is changing with AI and how can we prepare individuals, teams, leaders, decision makers to better think about all of the different facets of our organizations that we know are being pressure tested and in many cases ought to evolve and adapt alongside this transformative technology. And it's every day is changing in terms of the market, as you know, the landscape. And it's something that I'm deeply passionate about in terms of how do we equip people with more data-driven, evidence-backed insights into how the world of work is changing.
Great. And so how does that then translate into meetings as a topic, into your best meeting ever? I have a hypothesis, and you can, it just feels like things never went back to prior to COVID, after COVID. And we just are every single meeting I'm on, people are saying I'm back to back to back, which is not an effective way. So what compelled you to write the book?
A few reasons, and you're exactly right. In many cases, meetings have become more and more dysfunctional since the pandemic. And that is because, similar to how we're treating AI in so many cases, a technology does not magically solve any of our problems. Usually it amplifies what already exists. And so when you have broken collaboration, coordination foundations in your organization, hybrid work, remote work is not going to fix that. Neither is AI. And as I became more and more focused on collaboration, the science of collaboration, I was helping companies of all shapes and sizes think about how to collaborate more effectively. Meetings consistently are the tip of the iceberg. Usually they're not the root problem, the fundamental problem, but they're the most visible and also visceral problem. The fact that I could go into any organization and trigger this visceral negative reaction around meetings. We are socially conditioned to believe meetings are bad. They've largely remained unchanged for decades and decades. And from a practitioner standpoint, that's very frustrating. It's deeply frustrating that this is the case. But from a research perspective, it's absolutely fascinating. Why do we cling to this practice we know is broken, we know is dysfunctional, has remained largely unchanged for decades, and yet we continue to deploy them and deploy them more and more?
Yeah. And it's led to the saying, this meeting should have been an email. And it seems like we're still not doing that. And we have so much more at our disposal, not just email, obviously, but these collaborative ways of working with each other. But we still feel this need to have meetings. And it doesn't feel like it's because of the social needs of humans. It seems to be something completely different.
You're exactly right. And I think there is a level of social interaction. And I work with a lot of hybrid organizations and remote organizations. And in those organizations in particular, often we use meetings to establish and maintain connection when we also know they're not the right mechanism to do that most effectively. But fundamentally, this is a problem of what I sometimes call and others call visibility bias, right? We as humans associate visibility with value. And that's a problem in our workplaces because so much of how we work is invisible, right? It's very hard to see someone thinking carefully through a problem or rewriting that email for the 11th, 12th, 13th time. But meetings are highly visible. They're the most visible form of work we have. Often we can see other people's calendars. We can see people in a conference room leaning into a Zoom screen. And I find in particular in organizations where employees don't have clarity in terms of their goals, what the business is doing, what the business is trying to do, meetings become a status symbol and a way to show progress and productivity. And we all feel it. We see a packed calendar and our first reaction is, wow, that person must be busy, must be important, must have high status in the organization. And we're never going to fix that unless we decouple the performance of busyness from actual work.
I love what you just said. I've been on a mission the past few years to take the word busy out of my vocabulary. And I've said this on the podcast before. Every single person in this world is busy. I mean, some are busy watching Netflix. Some are busy loafing around all day, but we're all filling our calendars with stuff. Right. So if we can get away from busy is the goal, and if I'm not busy, I'm lesser than, we need to get to that place to actually have productive outcomes versus always the hamster wheel of being busy.
Absolutely. And it couldn't be more important, in my opinion, than right now with AI, because it's so easy to have this more is more mentality where I can use this to do more of the same thing. I can crank out more volume. It's feeding this visibility bias in a way that's very, very harmful, not always for the individual, but as soon as you get up into the team and organizational level, you can easily, and we see day to day, people will seek to maximize their own individual productivity in ways that come at the cost of the team and organization.
Yeah, I totally can see that. So your book opens with a very interesting anecdote that the OSS actually weaponized meetings as a wartime sabotage tactic during World War II, which, was eye-opening. I don't know if it made me laugh or cry, because obviously we're not trying, I don't think, to sabotage one another. So tell us about that story, and how does one even begin to make sense of this?
Right. And I think, this was a manual that was written, as you said, during World War II. It was written by the Office of Strategic Services, which was essentially the precursor to the CIA. And it was meant to advise ordinary citizens who were living in enemy territories as to different ways to sabotage the enemy from within. And these were ordinary citizens. So some of the tactics involved meetings, particularly, dragging meetings on, using a lot of channels, all of this bureaucracy that now we consider business as usual. It was advised as weapons of sabotage. And it's, as you said, it's funny, it's humorous, but it's also deeply concerning that what was once a weapon of sabotage is now business as usual. And, I think the visibility bias, the fact that we have these innate human tendencies that compel us to not only put meetings on the calendar, but also keep them on the calendar, right? There's immense social guilt associated with removing a meeting for most people. There are hardwired human behavior issues that need to be resolved in order to fix the problem.
Yeah, I feel like that story is it resonates so deeply that that alone should prompt our listeners to think about the next time you either schedule or accept a meeting.
Yeah. And think about it in terms of, not just you as the organizer, because disproportionately we see the people who leave the meeting most satisfied tend to be, the organizer, or this is great research from my colleague, Stephen Rogelberg, or the person who talks the most, right?
Yeah.
Often we don't think about, okay, all of the attendees, what do they need to get out of the meeting, and not just maximize, our own productivity through scheduling these calendar mechanisms.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. You talk also about the cost of meetings in organizations, specifically over 1.4 trillion annually in the US alone. That's mind-blowing. And that managers now spend nearly 6 hours a week in unproductive meetings, which I'd love to hear how you measure whether a meeting is productive or not productive. But it's up 87% since 2019, which again goes back to that point in the pandemic. How can leaders start actually measuring and surfacing this cost in a way that gets executive attention?
Yeah, it's a really big question. And this is probably the most common question I get right now in our age of efficiency over any other question, because there is this recognition that we need to solve this problem. We can't be spending this much time in unproductive meetings, but not knowing how to measure what's good or what's not. And so there are lots of different strategies. It highly is dependent on your organization, your team. Always my recommendation is the more we can tie our meetings to KPIs and existing business outcomes. This is also my recommendation for AI metrics, the better, because not only is that going to give you a better sense of what actually does move the needle in terms of the most important outcomes, but it gives you a language that if you're talking to executives, they're going to resonate with, right? If you're thinking about sales meetings and interactions with customers, the more you can tie that to the lifetime value of a customer or customer sentiment, the more it's going to resonate with the stakeholders in the room. I recommend everyone think about what I refer to in the book as return on time investment. And this is a concept I learned from my friend and colleague, Elise Keith, who came up with those great statistics around, the cost of meetings. After about 10% of the meetings you run, ask attendees, was this worth the time you invested? A simple 0 to 5 scale. It's something that we can all do if we're running meetings. And it gives us a very good gut check in terms of, does this meeting need to be on the calendar? Because you'll either see, 1, 2, 0 ratings, or you'll see 4 and 5s, or you'll see a mix. And in the case of the mix, that's a good indication that the meeting is valuable for some people, but not everyone. And, we don't take the time to think about, okay, if we're asking people to invest the time in this meeting, how do we make sure that investment is well spent? And if it's not, let's get into a motion and deliberately remove those meetings that are no longer working for our organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. Being a lot more disciplined about agenda and attendees, and we'll get a little bit deeper in that in a second. But I'd love to go to your central argument in the book, which is that meetings should be treated like products. Your most expensive, overlooked product. So what does that reframe actually look like in practice? And I'd love to tackle an example like our favorite HR process, the dreaded company-wide performance review cycle. What would that look like?
Sure. So this is the premise of the book, and the idea being, if we are going to treat meetings as a product, we should be applying the same product design principles that we know make great products great. And intentionality is the key word here, right? We would never launch a product to our customers, and that includes, we would never, in theory, launch a product to our employees as a HR practice without design, testing, feedback, iteration. We do that with meetings every single day. So some of the principles that are absolutely important, measurement we've spoken about, right? If you're going to look at performance review cycles and that process, making sure you're collecting feedback from employees in terms of what's working, what's not. User-centric design is very important. So often, I've studied performance reviews in depth for many years, and often they're these, once a year, once every 6 months, deeply stressful activities that are point in time, and employees end up being very frustrated that their contributions are not fully accounted for because we do have recency bias. So thinking about, okay, am I really structuring this process with the user in mind, or am I structuring it for the manager, or because of the status quo, what we have known and grown up to believe constitutes an effective performance review process? I think that I talk a lot in the book about meeting minimalism and thinking about what is the MVP that is going to work in this situation. And I think that very much translates to something like performance reviews as well. We don't, in particular with AI right now, we don't need these lengthy, drawn out processes that require so much manual routine work from employees. We can now leverage technology to be much more consistent in our feedback and deliver real-time feedback in a way that doesn't require a lot of heavy lifting on the part of employees. And then I think technology is a big part as well. Just as we continually innovate our products with technology, we should be doing the same for our meetings. We should be doing the same for performance reviews as well. We've seen massive shifts over the past 2 years when it comes to Gen AI and now agentic AI. If your performance reviews have looked the same pre-AI, during the generative AI rise, and now during the agentic rise, that's a problem. It's a good indication that you probably aren't iterating with the technology.
Yeah, it's a really good gut check. And I think not only about the, one-on-one performance reviews that happen, but all the calibration sessions that happen leading up to that one-on-one meeting. And I mean, I assume it's because we're trying to create a science out of something that's really an art. And actually, we can be more scientific now with AI. But, we thought that by having 8 hours of meetings prior to the manager having the one-on-one discussion with the employee, that meant that it was, really objective data that was being communicated.
I think this is the perfect example of, how effective organizations take something like a performance review process, a process, and start to rethink it. Because absolutely the answer, and I've seen this unfortunately in organizations, the answer is not to automate the entire performance review cycle, right?
Yes.
It's to be really vigilant and disciplined about, okay, what parts of this process needs to be deeply human. When you're delivering the feedback, for example, that's a deeply human activity. But what are the parts that we can automate or augment? And how do we give employees tools to do that effectively and in a way that removes some of the biases that we know are, have infiltrated performance review processes since the beginning of performance review processes.
Yeah. I think we're just conditioned to think that there's less bias the more time we spend together.
Yeah. And again, there's a term I reference in the book, process is a proxy, and it comes from Amazon. This idea that we often think that doing the thing is enough. Holding the meeting is enough. Doing the performance review is enough for it to be good. We confuse the process with, okay, what are we actually trying to achieve? What is the desired outcome? And that decoupling is so important. Not taking the process for granted as a checkbox, but thinking and having the discipline to rethink the status quo in terms of, okay, we now have new tools, we now have new, states of work. If we are to rebuild from scratch, how might we design this process in a way that is in the best interest of employees, teams, and the organization at large?
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept. So let's stick with AI. We're at that point where I want to talk a little bit more about AI. So you're pretty direct that AI obviously will not rescue us from bad meetings. You even mention that people are sending digital twins. I mean, I can't even stand when people send digital note takers. I know that AI Companion exists in this, and I love it, and it's on right now. But the digital note taker feels so intrusive for some reason. Where does technology actually help versus where does it hinder us in meetings?
It's such an important point. And unfortunately, as we're seeing outside of meetings, I'm seeing more examples of AI making things worse when it involves humans than the reverse. And that is because we often are using the technology to check a box or because we think we need to use the technology. And there is so much pressure right now from every direction, from boards, from customers, from competitors. There's a tendency to believe that we should AI-ify everything.
Yes.
And that's very, very dangerous because we know that, the best work that happens in our organizations, that is driven by a sense of purpose and ownership on the part of employees. If we start to automate, sometimes my colleague and I, Bob Sutton, will call it automating the soul of work, right? If we think about meetings and those one-on-one interactions, they're overwhelmingly, organizations right now are automating, sometimes very unintentionally, automating things that workers would prefer to keep human.
Yeah.
And when we do that, employees lose a sense of ownership. They lose a sense of purpose. We start to see a whole host of negative consequences in terms of the quality of their output using AI as opposed to thinking deeply for themselves. And we need to become much more, targeted about when do we use this technology, where are the guardrails, and what needs to remain deeply human. And it's hard because it's different for every organization.
Yeah, certainly, and every person, really.
Every person for sure. Certainly there's performance reviews, for example. There are components of that every organization, I think should be keeping that human versus automating. But
yes,
a lot of it depends on our culture, our values, what we've done in the past. And it's a hard calculus, but it's an important one.
Yeah, it's really important to make deliberate decisions there. So I'm going to go back to my prompt: to AI or not to AI for brainstorming sessions.
This is another one where I think it heavily depends on the context and how we're using the technology. So there is, and I reference in the book, a fascinating study that showed when you're using AI to play sort of a devil's advocate role, that can be immensely impactful, right? Because often we do get in the stance of groupthink. We're biased by the loudest person in the room or the most powerful person in the room. If we've gotten into that state of groupthink, having an objective or perceived objective AI say something like, have you considered other viewpoints? Have you considered other opinions? That has been shown to sort of dislodge that groupthink and leave people more satisfied with the outcome of the meeting. But there's a real danger in moving that too early in the brainstorming process. And here is where I think it highly depends on what you're trying to achieve and what are all the sort of variables around it. So often in our organization, we need to brainstorm, but we also need to brainstorm efficiently. We don't have the luxury of, maximizing for creativity and innovation. We're weighing different trade-offs. And in those cases, probably having AI come in earlier is going to be helpful because we have different things that we're trying to optimize for and balance. But if you're a deeply creative person, for example, a writer, or I've talked recently to a lot of script writers, movie makers, right? If we're bringing AI too early in the process, we're going to not only sort of disrupt that natural human creativity that is not only important for novelty, but also important for commitment. And what we're starting to see, which I think is fascinating, is when AI is used for idea generation, people become much less attached to the idea. And so as soon as someone comes and pushes back, they're much more likely to relinquish the idea, whereas pre-AI, they would push forward and persevere and, fight back because they'd invested that cognitive and other time in the idea generation process. And so even if we're thinking, we need to be thinking beyond just creativity in terms of parts of the brainstorm process have hidden benefits in terms of that sense of ownership. Sometimes it's called the IKEA effect, right? When we build something ourselves, we're more likely to stick to it and value it. And that's important, thinking about the system and not just the narrow task at hand.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm wondering, though, if someone's pushing back on my idea and I relinquish it, or I'm open to challenge, maybe that's not a bad thing all the time, because sometimes you're so wed to your idea that you're not open to thinking about other ideas.
And that's why this is hard, in the context and the sort of phenomenon I'm referencing, where Bob and I first heard about this concept was in the context of entrepreneurship. And one of our good friends, Perry Claiborne, who former CEO of Patagonia, now a lecturer at the Stanford Design School, he was seeing this effect in his students as part of entrepreneurship classes, where, we know that sense of perseverance, the high rate of failures in entrepreneurship, fighting through persevering is very, very important. In other contexts, less so. And you probably want that. And so, that's what makes it challenging, but also that's what makes it exciting in many ways, because it's not cut and dried, right?
Yeah.
We need to think about the context, our context as individuals, the team, the environment as well.
And what you're describing is what we've all been talking about so much, which is critical thinking, right? Like you can't, I keep on saying it's not a set it and forget it situation. It's not a one size fits all situation. And the debate that I was hearing to AI or not to AI with brainstorming, there was no one right answer, right? Like so I know authors who say, AI is so useful to get through the blank sheet of paper. But other authors would say, I would never do that because I want my original ideas to come from my brain. And then I use AI AI to edit it, right? So same with brainstorming meetings and these types of meetings. You really have to keep in mind not just the dynamic of the team, the outcome you want to achieve, the people and their maturity and how much critical thinking they've already built in their career. All sorts of different nuances, but a very, very powerful tool.
Absolutely. No, you put it so well, for sure.
Great. Well, we are unfortunately getting close to the end of our time together. So I have 3 more questions. One is most of our listeners are HR leaders. So what is one tip you have for them to make the next meeting they have, like either right after they listen to this or tomorrow, the best one ever?
This is so highly dependent on the culture within the organization. There are 2 types of organizations and leaders that will come to me. One is, the leader or the organization that is willing and ready to make a radical change. And in those cases, my recommendation is start with a calendar cleanse. I call it a meeting doomsday, a 48-hour calendar cleanse done very intentionally involving employees, but rebuild the calendars from scratch. The second group is the more reluctant one, right? They're not ready to do a full calendar cleanse, but they need something to get started in terms of resetting their meeting culture. In those cases, the most effective first step is to ensure that you as an organization or a team have an explicit codified rule in terms of what deserves to be a meeting in our organization. So few organizations or teams have that. And it's the simplest way. It's not easy, but it's the simplest way to give employees clarity in terms of not only when do I schedule a meeting, but when can I push back when I know this meeting is not worth my time. If employees have a concrete thing to point to, they're much more willing to point to that and push back.
Yeah, I love that tip. And also, it's okay to cancel a meeting even right before if you don't think it's worthwhile, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes
Absolutely.
we're worried about like wasting people's time. Oh, they've blocked the time, so let's just have the meeting. But it's okay to cancel, right?
People consider it a gift, in most cases. The one exception I would say is one-to-one meetings with the manager and direct that, that often triggers immense anxiety because often the manager won't give an explanation for they're so busy, something's come up, they'll remove it from the calendar and then the employee panics. But in almost all other situations, in general, people respect it. They thank you for it. They consider it a gift of time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can always say, like, instead of meeting, let's all go into this asynchronous document and put in our thoughts, and then we'll regroup afterwards if we don't think we're ready for the meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Final 2 questions are most important. Number 1 is how can our listeners find out more about the great work you're doing?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit. My website's RebeccaHines.com. Our Work AI Institute is workai.institute with some of our latest AI research.
Great. And we'll put that in the show notes. And finally, we like to end with a feel good. So Rebecca, what are you feeling good about today?
I'm feeling good about my team. I have an amazing team and, it makes all the difference. It makes all the difference. This is something that AI is never going to replace when you go to work every day and you're inspired by other people and people step up and, are willing to be team players. I'm fortunate that I have that to an extent that I've never, I think, had as deeply right now. And I'm very grateful for that.
Great. Very lucky. Not everybody could say the same. So that's a great way to end, a great high note to end on. Thank you so much for being a fabulous guest. I could have talked about this topic for way longer. We may have to schedule another episode. But until next time, everyone, take care.